Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hey, welcome to the Church in Action podcast. I'm Charles Galda. We believe that when the people of God are known for love and unity and doing good works to serve others and fix our communities, it's evangelistic. That's what Jesus is talking about in John 17 and Matthew 5. And so that's why Jesus tells us to make disciples, because when we're living like Jesus as disciples, we're willing to disadvantage ourselves like Jesus to benefit others, to love each other. And when we do that, people want to know about our Jesus. And so our podcast talks about issues of God and culture to accelerate our ability to make disciples who love our neighbors, who do justice and share Jesus to transform our world. And so today I've got two special guests back with me, the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, who's the senior pastor at Bethel AME in Jamaica Plains, and Pastor Enoch Liao, who's the pastor at Boston Chinese Evangelical Church. And so guys, welcome back.
Good to be back.
It's great to be here.
Well, we'll see. You guys may change your before we're done.
I'm here to just watch you two talk. That's all I'm here for. This is great. I get a front row seat every month.
And so this episode continues our series that Enoch and Ray and I have been doing, talking about contemporary issues. Our goal is to practice letting our policy preference flow from our theology, and to show that we can disagree in Christian love, show that polarizing issues are more complex than the secular arena pretends, to understand each other's perspectives better so we can be peacemakers and bring unity, breaking down the partisan walls that divide the church. A pastor friend of mine used an analogy not too long ago that said, if you think about that Jewish-Gentile divide in the early church, for us, that's Republican-Democrat divide. And so we want to break that down. So today we're going to talk about the voting reform bill that was recently passed in Georgia. One of the great successes of the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It prohibited, among other things, literacy tests, and more broadly, any restrictions that had a discriminatory impact on people based on race. And so this was really to remedy the history of Jim Crow, which used tools to prevent Blacks from registering. That included poll taxes, literacy tests, which were not about literacy, but often required a subjective interpretation of a statute and law that then was used to disqualify someone, as well as intimidation and violence. Prior to that, in the northern states, just so we're not just talking about the South, it was a bit of a mixed bag all over the place, with African Americans at times having the right to vote, African American men before the Civil War, before the franchise was expanded to women, and then restricting it or allowing it in limited circumstances. So it was a little bit more of a mixed bag. The proponents of the Georgia bill argue it was necessary to address alleged fraud claims in the 2020 presidential election and the gubernatorial election before that, where both a Republican in the presidential election and a Democrat in the gubernatorial election rejected the votes as invalid and would not accept the outcome. Additionally, a number of emergency changes were put in place at the last minute, sometimes improperly in some states, but also that they wanted to make permanent, that would not be allowed outside of the emergency provisions. It's become a very controversial bill, as I think everybody knows. President Biden characterized the law as Jim Crow on steroids and said it was despicable and the most pernicious thing. It makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. The CEOs of Coke and Delta spoke out against it. Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game. The New York Times said it was a breathtaking assertion of partisan power, making absentee voting harder and creating restrictions and complications for voters. Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal on the other side said that after several states implemented more rigorous voter identification requirements in the early 2000s, liberals cried foul and said this would depress Black voter turnout. And in places like Georgia and Indiana, it's actually increased. The Heritage Foundation has found things like voter ID hasn't changed, doesn't show any difference between votes with it and without it in terms of whether an African American is likely to vote or not. And the census has published a number of pieces talking about how actually the African American share of the vote has been growing in recent years, continuing a trend that started back in the 90s. So others charge this is really about the fact that President Trump increased his share of the black vote, especially among black men. And so Democrats are playing the race card and trying to build a case for House Resolution 1, which is something Democrats are proposing that critics charge will give Democrats an advantage in voting. So as I was saying to Enoch before we started, so we've got politicians playing politics all over this. Who'd have guessed such a thing could happen in this country? So doing some penance for some sin I did somewhere, I read the legislation so I could say, well, I'm speaking from a firsthand perspective on some of it. That doesn't make me an expert on it, of course, but wanted to do that. And it's 98 pages. On the whole, it struck me as balanced. It expands the franchise in some places, it restricts it in others, it increases controls, but it's that restrictions in others that's driving the debate. And so that's probably where I'm going to guess we'll end up focusing today, but we're going to try and tick through all of it. But guys, before we start, let's put a theological lens on this, because we really want to get in the practice of, let's start with our theology and then get to what we think on policy, knowing we still may not agree on the policy, but we've come at it from a biblical perspective. And so help me out. What biblically helps inform my thinking on something like voting rights?
I'd just throw out two things, and this is in no way to denigrate or the particular bill itself, so much as to say, I think one issue is the question of, what should I say, both honesty and proportionality. So if we say we're trying to fix a problem, what's the problem that we're trying to fix, and what's the basis on which we say it's a problem? Is it people's claims, often who've lost, or is it evidence? Is it facts? Is it studies that demonstrate this is a problem that needs to be addressed? And I think one of the big challenges here is that there is a huge disagreement around the problem of fraud. There are all kinds of claims about fraud, but not very much convincing evidence. There is, I think, in the part of other people, the concern, a deep concern, not just about the racial issues, but about voter participation and citizen participation. And so the question is, how do you, not just on a racial basis, but across the citizenry, increase participation in a democracy? So that for me is one critical issue. What's the basis on which we say there is a problem that needs to be fixed? Can it be simply because people claim it, or does it have to be on the basis of real evidence? And then, yeah.
So I was just saying, does that flow from a biblical?
I think so. I'm saying in the sense that I think, I don't think on a biblical basis I can identify something as problematic or in need of correction if in fact that statement isn't true, or I don't have evidence for that. I think biblically I'm held to a standard that says I really do have to show evidence of a wrong. Can't simply, in fact, it's got to be in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, right? So I think there's an issue there, and that only exacerbates the similar problem, which is what you might call, what's a person's intent? But we can come to that a little bit later. So I think that's one issue, and I think, as I say, in the context of a democratic system that derives its legitimacy from the participation of its people, if there's in fact evidence that participation is a problem, that's an issue we should address. That's, I think, one question, one of many.
Can I add in addition, but don't feel like you have to, so I'm asking, can I add into that there's either a wrong or a risk of a wrong? Or is it no, only a wrong? Are you okay with that?
No, I think if there's credible evidence of a risk,
okay,
right? There's always risk no matter what we do. I think, as we've said earlier, increasing participation almost by its nature, to some extent, are going to provide greater opportunities for fraud. You put in place the things that will help that as best you can. That's entirely appropriate. But there's always the question again of what's proportional to the actual risk, not the claimed risk.
And you just hit on a key piece here. Is one of the things they do talk about in the legislation, whether we accept the meaning of it or not, or the intent behind it, is that voting should be easy as possible and hard to cheat. And those things operate in tension with each other.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Enoch, what would you say?
Yeah, no, this is, again, appreciate the conversation, appreciate your helping us frame the conversation, and really appreciate what Ray said, learning a ton. For me, because I really think there's a big difference between the principle and the policy, I would back even further away from the Georgia bill and thinking about at least two lines of thought. I did look in my concordance for voter Bible verses, and I didn't find too many. A couple thoughts. One, let's do two angles. One would be about the social responsibility, the civic concern that God's people should have. And the second is about access. I think in a democratic society, well, Christians are called to be salt and light. And there are times that, depending on the form of government and the relative balance of power throughout church history, Christians have employed and wrestled theologically with different things. One of my friends is a church historian, and one of the observations he makes is things like the just war theory and those sorts of philosophies and theological sort of developments, they were wrought in seasons of history where Christians were more in power or populous or had more influence. And so when you have those places of, you have more power, and I don't mean power in a negative sense, but they need to develop the theology needed to apply rather than being the theology of the minority or the persecuted. They need to have a theology that held them accountable and be responsible with power, influence, and wealth. So from a social responsibility standpoint, a Christian is called to love and serve all, including the poor, and Old Testament, New Testament, God's heart, special concern, if you will, for the downcast and the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the prisoner, the foreigner, and so forth. Therefore, I think just building this sort of theological basis, voting is not only a great privilege, but a responsibility for a Christian. Even though one might say, I live in a place where my vote is going to be so small that it won't affect the outcome, all those things. And I get that's a practical thing. But on a biblical standpoint, there's a point of participation. And I get it. If you're super busy and you're like helping someone get to the hospital and you don't vote in an election that wouldn't have mattered anyway, yeah, we can navigate those really tactical things. But I think from a social responsibility standpoint, voting is important. And therefore, in a democratic society, it's important that we have access to voting. So that brings us to the second point, access. Again, my concordance didn't have a lot of Bible verses about voter registration and things like that. But from a biblical standpoint, I think, and this is not a super tight analogy, but I think Christians, Old and New Testament Christians, should really cherish this notion of access to God, access to the opportunity for power and things. And again, I don't mean power in a sort of postmodern, highly negative, cynical thing, but in the best sense of meekness, power under control. And so therefore, I think if we look at the whole point of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews is about God granting us access to his very presence. And so I think, again, I'm not going to draw a super tight analogy between access to the heavenly throne, the throne of grace, with voter access, but I do think we should be about helping people have access to exercise their social responsibility. So those are two thoughts. But from another standpoint, I would come back and offer a corrective or a warning, at least for myself and perhaps for others who might find this relevant. Folks like have pointed out that an idol is anything that we value more than God. And the best idols, quote unquote, best idols, or the most pernicious idols, or idols are actually good things that we make into ultimate or great things. There's a thing that is right now that is so uncontested in culture in the US and in Christians that I hesitate to bring it up. I'm going to say it's a good thing, but it should not be the ultimate thing. The ultimate thing should be God and his glory. But that really important thing, which I feel like at times has become an ultimate thing, at least when I struggle in my own heart, is that of being heard. So being heard or being seen. is a biblical thing. In fact, I'd love to do a sermon series on what it means that God sees you. I mean, that's Older Testament. God has seen everything, good and bad. So, but I do think that the fact of the voice being heard has somehow taken such a high place that it's almost like one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt let your voice be heard, or make your voice known. And I get it when it comes to especially issues right now of racial injustice and criminalization and brutality from law enforcement and all these sorts of things. So I'm not at all squashing voices being heard, but I think voter turnout, one of the reasons why it has created such a robust and strong emotional reaction is because I think it's touching on this really important concept, which is biblical, but maybe is bigger than we mean to be, which is being heard. I think there are even bigger things than being heard, such as being known by Jesus, and get to real theological. But I think that is why this is so important. This is about my voice being heard. And I think as Christians, it is about helping people have that place. So that's how I think about it getting here. Again, far cry from policy, far cry from evaluating the Georgia bill. But I do think that's some of the theological bases. What does it mean to do responsible citizenship? What does it mean to love your neighbor? What does it mean to provide access? And what does it mean to have voices be heard, and yet recognizing they would to mitigate that against other competing things, right? So those are some things just to tee it up.
Yeah, I think those are all great thoughts, guys. I kind of keep coming back to love thy neighbor, right? If I love you, I shouldn't want my vote to count more than you, and I shouldn't want to make your life harder to get to vote. And there's I call it fair play, but I think I really mean justice, right? It's the rule of fair play. You don't have to be biblical to get your head around the rule of fair play, but justice would say that in a system that says we can vote and that elects our leaders, it would be unjust of me to deprive you of that or make it harder for you to do that. And it would be unjust for me to make it so easy that your votes don't really matter because there's so much fraud in the system that it's we can't even trust the results, and then people don't vote. So I think there's a justice issue both ways on it. Ubre, we can't hear you.
And I would agree. The concurrent piece is that it would be unjust if there were evidence of fraud or misuse of the system for me to allow that to continue. Or, and this always gets to the question, what is a reasonable check to ensure that the system has integrity? And of course, this is always where the battle comes, because I agree that both are necessary to meet the test of just.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And so let me kind of take chunks of the bill. I put them in somewhat arbitrary categories to kind of hit on the different pieces. And some of them I think we can just check off and say, no issue, keep going. And then the other ones I think we'll want to park on a little bit. But I'll leave it up to you guys where you guys think that is. So the first thing is they shortened the runoff time for a runoff election to 28 days from 2 months. We good with that one? Right. I don't want to sit and wait two months to find out who's going to control the Senate anymore. I think I think do it the next day. Right.
My first thought for almost all of these things will be, I probably don't know enough to it's one thing to say, I don't see a problem.
Right.
But actually, can I say one more thing before we get into the chunks that relates to this? It's not necessarily biblical, but it may help preface this. And it actually dovetails with what Dr. Hammond just said. What is the evidence and basis? And I do think that's a valid and vital question. It probably is one of the most important questions. But let me address not the intent, but the sort of the epistemological and political reality of people. By epistemological, I mean the mindset of what they believe is to be true, and the political reality meaning, honestly, what is an elected official going to do? Yes, there's a big difference in terms of how much fraud happened, perception of that in the last election. But if you, and again, there's a danger in enacting legislation because of that, because you might be validating sort of statements that there was certain fraud to this degree. So I get there's a truth issue there. At the same time, politically and pragmatically, I do think that even if you're behind closed doors, when there's no camera, no Twitter, just you're talking honestly, if someone is of a certain political party and your base cries foul, and you don't address it, I'm not sure what that bodes for the following election. again, it's tricky, and we got to pray for our political leaders. It is not easy, but I can understand the challenge where on a political, and I don't mean negative political, but I mean on a tactical thing. If you don't make any change at all in light of a huge chunk of the population, or maybe not huge, a loud chunk of the population, and actually I don't know the numbers, who really believe it's fraud. There are people in my church that are so glad that the presidency went to a certain person. There are also people that I know in my church and in our community that think it was literally stolen, and they would have us pray that justice would be, return the presidency to the previous president. So given those things, a part of me says, on a political, practical thing, evidence aside, which is what Dr. Hammond said, which is totally true, we might need to do something to demonstrate, to protect from a future accusation of, yeah, you didn't change anything. Again, that's tough because you're not trying to necessarily agree or validate the other pieces there. So I just think it's really challenging, and to be in elected office, and to be these men and women that have to make these choices. So I think that's part of the political reality, that if I were to hear, quite honestly, Republicans behind closed doors, and I don't know any elected officials in Georgia, but drawing from my limited experience here in Boston and Massachusetts and other places where I've had friends in elected office, that is one of the long-term discussions. Like, if we don't do anything now, we're gonna have a much bigger problem. And again, that's tricky because you don't want to validate something you think is wrong, but that's not this. Our democratic system should be, but isn't based on truth. It's based on vote. So if it was based on truth, it'd be totally different, but it's based on voting. And so, I mean, hopefully voting is based on truth, right? But truth can be subjective. So when we get to that, I just think that's a challenge when we get to these things. So from this lens point of, some people might say the best thing you can have in an intractable, polarized system is legislation that calms and quells some of the quote unquote accusations of fraud. But to Dr. Hammond's point, is a reasonable check and really doesn't go too far. And again, someone might just be offended that we're even talking about this because there was no fraud. And I get that that's a perspective, but there's someone else. Yeah. So just putting it out there, just,
I think it's fair. We should be balanced on this, because it's not just Republicans that claim fraud, right? In the governor's race, right, Democratic national leadership, state leadership, and base claimed fraud and rejected the results. In the Republican president, in the presidential election, Republican national leaders and base also said fraud. Right now, that raised point I agree on. Okay, I'm not convinced of fraud on either of those two cases. Yeah. But I hear you saying, hey, but sometimes perception's reality.
Yeah.
And 2 elections where that's happened, if I'm an elected official in Georgia. Now, there's other stuff in the bill unrelated to fraud, but that was part of the motivation.
Right. And I guess I say that only
I have to do something.
Right. And just the last thing I'll say about this thing is, because in a conversation among Christians, this is my attempt to show grace, to try to understand where different parties are coming from. Not at all necessarily agreeing with anyone, but I think I'm just trying to help people see. I have had the privilege, like maybe Dr. Hammond, I've actually known a lot of more elected officials in our city and state in the last few years, and man, their job is tough. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I think it's a lot more complicated behind the scenes, but maybe again, the public, more simple in the eyes of the public, and that holds them accountable, right? So just putting it out there.
Right.
One other element, if I might add to that, because I do think this is part of the challenge for leadership on either side. And you are absolutely right. The political pressure can be enormous, as you say, not so much from the other side, but people on your own side in the coming primary. No question about that. But again, and you see, I think, elements of this in Proverbs and other places where it really talks about the importance of leaders not making sudden or rash judgments, because tempers do cool and people do get new evidence. And the presumption is that the Russians changed the election in 2016. And over time, it becomes clearer that it's a more complicated story than that. They were there fiddling, as they have been probably for some time, but that's probably not the real source. So this again gets back, I think, to the critical role of leaders to not be fueling rumors, passions that will probably over the course of time show to be far more complicated than people originally imagined, no matter who's winning or who's losing.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a quote, Ray, and I don't remember who I'm stealing it from, but they said, I I must follow the people, for I am their leader. And so let me jump into what I'm going to bundle as election efficiency, and these aren't perfect categories by any stretch. And so one requires the polling precinct registrars to time the lines. I think it was 4 times a day. And if the lines are more than an hour consistently, they need to submit a remediation plan to fix that by the next election. I'm going to assume we're all good with that. The next thing that it requires is that, to the extent there are continuing complaints about a polling place that are not remedied over multiple election cycles, the state has the ability to take over those precincts and fix it. And I'm going to assume we're okay with that. So I'll keep going, guys. You stop me if you hear something you don't like. It restricted the ability this year because of the pandemic. Private people came in and started giving grants to to towns to run the election, and the state has said that is not allowed. All elections must be funded by the state or locality. If you go to the wrong polling place, you can't vote at the wrong polling place. You will be redirected to the right polling place, unless it's within 2 hours of the polls closing, in which case you'll be able to cast a provisional ballot where you showed up, but then will have to be determined whether that was a valid vote or not, because you may not be able to get to the polling place in time, is I assume why they allow that at the end of the day. And that the Attorney General has to create a staff hotline for people to report election improprieties for action. We good with all those?
Don't see any problem, right?
I think
like easy, right? Go ahead.
so. Well, I would say about the location thing. I think a lot of this comes down. It's funny because on the call we did like 2 months ago about the minimum wage, I think Ray and I both said, well, at some point, the localities have to, deal with it, right? But the interesting thing is, especially with, and we're not talking about today, but HR1 and other things, I think it's really about, not the locality, but the state and maybe even the federal government coming in if there's allegations and things. So I wonder, how do I reconcile that in my mind? But I guess for all of these things, I think it has to be constantly evaluated afterwards, and to make sure that it's doing what its job is doing. I think the whole polling location thing, I don't know if in Georgia you can move your location because it may be based on work and other things, because I think that's a big issue for people. Some of the articles that we read preparing for this talks about the social economic predisposition. And so if you have a job that makes you have to move around, I think it's a lot trickier. And then the argument might go that certain minorities have the kinds of jobs that maybe don't, or the economic situations that don't let them have that flexibility to do that, or the other life situations like childcare. So
let's shift to where there's some flexibility provided to address those kinds of situations, if that's the case. And so the next one I'll call absentee voting. But we probably should bundle it with hours too, because they all play in the same thing. But let's just deal with absentee for right now. And so the law implements, and this is new to Georgia, no excuse absentee balloting. So where I grew up and lived most of my life, and where I am today, I have to have if I'm going to request an absentee ballot, I need an excuse. I have to certify I will be out of town, right? Or I'm sick in the hospital. I have to give an excuse. Georgia and other states have this too, not all. No excuse absentee voting, and you can request an absentee ballot up to 78 days before the election. That's down from 180 days, and the cutoff is 11 days before the election, and that's to address the post office. Actually, it's not tight enough. The post office says it should be 14 days beforehand, because that's how long they'll guarantee the mail will take. And so they implement no excuse absentee balloting you can request it almost 80 days beforehand, and it has to be in 11 days beforehand. You need to provide an ID number to get the absentee ballot. So they're trying to get away from matching signatures on the voting day. So they verify who you are when you request the ballot, and you give a number. Now, that can be a driver's license number, it can be a state ID. If you don't have that, you can provide a utility bill or other things like that to prove who you are. And then if you don't even have that, you can just vote in the registrar's office, and then you don't need to have any of those things. It forbids sending absentee ballots to voters unless the voter requests one, and then has a lot of regulations about what it looks like, because there were people printing up ballots and sending them to people, and that was creating confusion. It allows election workers to start counting early, so we don't have to wait till election night to start counting all those absentee ballots. And the ballot has to arrive by election day. You guys okay with those?
I would only say probably I'd be happier with 90 days, ending 14 days, something that really gives people, I think, a larger window if in fact you're going to insist that they arrive by election day, because you're then caught up again with the vagaries of the postal system. So,
and that happened in some states.
Oh my God! Don't get me started with our challenges with the postal system.
Right, you can mail them 3 days ahead of time, and there's no way you can get it there by election day. Not this past year, but not under normal circumstances. It can't be guaranteed. So 90 to 14. I'd be better with 14 too, because if that's what the post office is saying, then I'd at least use that as the end point. Enoch, what about you? You okay? Or
yeah, again, just because I don't see big problems. I mean, my brain, limited as a layperson and non-expert in these issues as it is, I think there are seasons. It really depends on the mobilization of your political group to get that word out. So again, I've been in places where the absentee ballot was mailed to everybody. I think in California, where I grew up, we got the ballot, and then on that document we were given, we could right then and there request absentee ballot. So for years, I just voted by absentee ballot in California because it was convenient. I'm reading it, put it in the mail, they gave me a ballot, and I mail it in. It was great. But then there are times I've lived in other places where the deadline just came by, and I didn't, because I don't consume the kind of media, and so that, again, that's my concern. But that gets really tactical and gets really specific, and as a concept, I think it's trying to be fair, but I think we'll probably have to come back and take a look at that. The culture and the country is big on the actual election time, and a lot of people don't think about it until the actual election time is happening, when all the ads are going and people are talking about it. So I think that's the concern. In certain groups, that will we actually miss that deadline? And that's less about the number of days. That's about the outreach that goes with that as well.
Yeah, I should do full disclosure. I have a real bias about this stuff. I think I'm a process guy, so I think you need to control things, and things need to be controlled to make sure that you don't have defects. I have an audit background, right? So I just come at it from that mindset, and so I'm not a fan of early voting. I'm not a fan of absentee voting. I think we all ought to vote on the same day with the same set of facts, and that if you have a reason you need to vote absentee, I'm okay. I get that, and I'm fine with Ray. 90 to 14 days. I don't have any issue with that. I just don't like that we're all voting at different times, and in this case, courts were changing the rules while the voting was going on. I'm like, this, right?
And I think that movement, and as I say personally, I haven't voted on voting day I did it for years, decades, and I haven't done it at all for probably about 10 years. And completely appreciate how much easier it makes it when I don't have to move on the state schedule on a day between certain hours. Our lives just don't accommodate that anymore. Shift working, 24-hour round the clock, 2 and 3 jobs, just doesn't accommodate that very well anymore.
I think what you guys are telling me is right now is I'm a better Christian than you are, because I don't want to change anything, and Christians change. that may not be a good theological perspective. So let's go on to drop boxes then for absentee ballots. So here, the idea here is that I don't want to trust the mail. And so I'm going to fill out my absentee ballot at home, and I want to go drop it in a box. Now, this was something that Georgia allowed this year under an emergency order by the governor, but it's not something that's legal normally. So without legislation, drop boxes were going away. And so they passed, one of the features here is that they require drop boxes in every, I think it was in every precinct. And it allows for more than one based on what the Register of Voters wants to do. But it limits them based on population. So you have to have at least one per polling place, I think is the way it worked. But you can have more than one, but you can't have more than like 1 per 100,000 people or something like that. And it requires that during the hours the drop box is open, that somebody has to be there guarding it and watching it the entire time. And then it needs to be emptied overnight, so that ballots aren't sitting unattended overnight. And so that's so are we okay with that? No problem.
I mean, I guess it does more ways to do it. Like Ray said, I'm blessed. I walk 2 minutes to my vote, and I've polling place, and there's never been a line. Someone lives a street or two away, they have to drive like a lot farther just because of the way it works out. But I guess to your system's point, I just wonder if we are creating how reasonable it is, the strain on the whole overall system. And with more variation, there's more ways for it to fail or have problems or even be abused. But I guess that's we'll need data. I guess we'll come back and see. But as a concept, it all sounds great. Sure, more ways to do it, more convenient, more votes. That's great. But more legislation and more regulations too.
So the good news is we've gotten through the bulk of it yet. And so far, we're not having any real knee-jerk objections to it, but we're getting probably, I put in the order of easier to harder is what I assumed. And so now the next one is voting hours. And so today in Georgia, voting hours are 7 to 7. With the new legislation, they are minimally 9 to 5. And the registrar can expand them to be 7 to 7 if they like. They can expand them beyond 9 to 5, but not more than 7 to 7. And they introduced 2 Saturday voting days minimally, and they allow the registrar to also have 2 early voting Sundays. You guys okay with that?
I would say here I'd have to look at the pattern of people's voting. I don't know the data on that. That works fine for me because I've got a certain kind of flexibility in a context where, unlike say other countries where you can take time off for voting and leave work to vote, I just don't know how well this actually works for people who don't have the kind of flexibility I've got in my working situation.
Yeah.
So for me, the 7 to 9 looks like a better kind of option. People can go before they go to work at 9 in the morning, or after they're getting off at 5. They've still got a reasonable option, and get people fed and all that kind of homework done, whatever. I mean, so for me, the more flexibility. But I don't know what the actual data is. How many of those, if you make it till 9, how many people are showing up between 7 and 9?
My guess is it varies based on where you are.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I would guess this was a concession. I don't know this, but I would guess there's at least a concession to this, but going from 7 to 7 to 9 to 5, allowing rural counties that don't need to stay open till 7 because in your town, everybody's voted by, we know everybody's voted by now, and we might as well close up at 6 then, or 9 to 5. I would have left at 7 to 7, but my guess is there's cost there too.
Right.
And adding the 2 Saturdays, my guess is they're trying to make it a little more cost neutral, but I couldn't find debate on that. The criticism I found on this from some folks, and it was mostly African-American churches who would have they call it souls to polls.
Souls to the polls, yeah.
And so you go to church on Sunday, and with Sunday voting, they'd go to the poll and vote afterwards. And that was new to me. I didn't grow up with that.
Oh yeah, yeah. No.
And so in light of that, does that change anything on it for you guys? I looked and said, look, you've got no excuse absentee. You've got the Saturdays. You might have Sundays too. So I was kind of like, nah, kind of a wash. What do you guys think?
I think it goes back to what Ray is saying. What's the data say? What's best? I'm imagining, this is the Church New England Vision New England Church in Action podcast. I'm wondering some people in Georgia, why are these guys talking about our voting bill?
I know.
Like we should have gotten one of those because I think it like what we're trying to do is we're really scouring the internet for like substantive critiques and pushback for these types of things. But we're getting outlets, even the articles I confess that I read, which some I got from you, were all national coverage, as opposed to if I was doing more due diligence, I won't say if I had more time, I should have just read a bunch of local things, which actually some of the best reporting in the country are these really super nitty-gritty local things. So I guess on this one level, we just want to know that it works with people and serves those people. I can definitely see in a situation where if that's one of the best ways for people to mobilize, like people go to their religious service and then let's all go now afterwards to vote. I could see that being really, really important. But I guess it comes back down to hopefully all sides agree that we're trying to give people access and trying to give people the opportunity to make the vote. But you're right, cost, money, all that stuff, it just depends. But if you give too much freedom or too much variation, it can be very confusing. I could easily see a scenario that says, oh, I thought my poll closed at 9, but actually closed at 7. That poll closed at 9, the one by my office. So I assumed the poll by my house closed. So that's where, again, it comes down to policy versus accuracy. Like with face masks and during this pandemic, there's actually really good face masks, but because people don't use them properly, the government says, don't buy those, right? But it's not because there's something wrong with them, but because it's confusing, right? And so I think that's the simplicity of policy. And I'm pretty sure I made this point earlier. So on all these things, I could echo what Ray just said. Does it help people? And what does the data say? Let's see afterward. That's probably my best response at this point.
Could I add also very much, in many cases, I don't think there is as much argument necessarily about a specific provision as the concern about how it will be implemented. The nature of law, as we all know, is that it gives a general framework, right, and then you got the regulations that actually specify how that law is going to be implemented. And then you've got at the local level the way it's actually put into force. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I think my suspicion, again, this is just from some conversations that I've known with people who were actually involved in the situation with Georgia, is just, again, a deep concern about how things get implemented and what appears at least to be differential kind of implementation, depending on party, race, a number of other things, socioeconomic status, class, etc. So this is what I meant earlier about the question of intent, and it's very hard to get it. There's no way fully to put safeguards in. People just have to watch, and if they see patterns emerging, protest against them. But so again, I would say on the face of it, yes. As we've said, does this allow for enough flexibility for all of the different kinds of community, urban, rural, based on people's working? Does it give, again, equitable, equal opportunity to everybody across all of those? And to be honest, I don't know. Looks like it should, but again, I don't know quite how that's going to be implemented in Georgia. What are the concerns that people would have about implementation?
And it's an interesting point. None of the stuff I found, and I did read some of the local sources too, I didn't find the implementation concern, Ray, although I think that's a fundamental breakdown in our system these days. We do just pass these framework laws, and then unelected people figure out how we're going to implement them, as opposed to doing the hard work of figuring out this is what has to be done, and tasking people with doing it. And Enoch, I just want to point out to one of the points you made too, because there is a confusion issue that you run the risk for if it's different all over the place. But the other thing you run into is an equal protections issue, right? Because there have been places where the judge, there's a breakdown in a poll in a city someplace, and cities tend to vote more Democrat. And so a judge orders that the polls in the city can stay open 3 more hours. And then there's a lawsuit charging equal protection because, well, they closed at 6 o'clock where I live, and they close at 9 o'clock where you live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Right. In some sense, they're trying to address some of those kinds of things too in this. But I'd still prefer where I think Ray was at least alluding to is write laws that leave very little discretion on how they're implemented, so that I can hold my elected official accountable, not some bureaucrat who I don't even know and doesn't ever get up for a vote accountable. I'm opining now on the whole system, I think there's a big breakdown in the system. But we've made it through most, and none of us have are raising a point of no, look, we would agree with some of the inflammatory stuff that's out there. Food and drink is the last one. And so it disallows anyone from giving food or drink to people who are I'll say a little different. It forbids people from giving food or drink to anybody within 150 feet of the polling place, or within 25 feet of the line, assuming it goes way beyond the 150 feet. It does allow for water distribution stations that are unmanned. And this one has gotten a lot of criticism. And so how do you guys hear that one?
I find the argument, as I say, just personally, somewhat specious. And the reason I find it specious is because in Massachusetts, obviously, people are allowed to hand out voting literature, for example. Now, there's limits about how far they have to be, and they can't be obstructing people and so on. They can't be accosting people and buttonholing them and the whole 9 yards. But they can hand out a last reminder before you go in the polling. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's not unreasonable. And the notion that when people are standing out in the hot sun, because either the state was not able to provide enough people, or there's so much interest in the election that someone can't give someone a bottle of water or even something to eat, doesn't seem unreasonable to me. I don't think that's a bribe. Doesn't feel like a bribe. I don't know that it would sway my vote one whit. So again, in some respects, long lines, from my vantage point, represent a failure on the part of the electoral system. And for someone to mitigate that, rather than have people not vote, doesn't seem at all the problem. The problem is the electoral system that did not provide either other means for people to vote or enough manpower, machines, whatever was needed to make that vote less onerous.
And now there is stuff in the legislation that says, okay, well, then if the lines are that long, you need a plan to fix it next time, right? Doesn't change this time. And this doesn't stop anybody doing those things, right? Handing out food or drink beyond the 150 feet. And so
but it says within 25 feet of the line.
Of the line, yeah. So I can set up a booth 100 feet away from to call 200 feet, and I'm handing the stuff out as people go to get in line.
All right, but I was under the impression that either within 120, 150 feet of the polling place, or anywhere along the line, you can't be closer than 25 feet.
Yeah, I think that's right. So my point is, though, but you can be nowhere near the line and handing that stuff out. So if the line is within the 150 feet, you can just be at the end of the 150 feet handing out food and drink and campaigning and handing out literature. And so I read this as, I go back, I was involved in some election stuff years ago in Connecticut where I grew up, and you couldn't basically do anything within 75 feet. And you couldn't wear, I couldn't go into the polling place with a Biden t-shirt or a Trump t-shirt. They reject you and send you away because you're now campaigning in the polling place. So I come from a fairly strict background on it. So I looked at it and said, just set up, and people would set up that stuff outside the line. They didn't give out food in Connecticut, but they would just set up, you'd have, tents and stuff at the end of the 75-foot mark. And they'd be greeting you on the way in, they'd be handing you literature and stuff like that. And so I looked at it not too different from that, of they can still do that stuff, it's just controlled where they can do it.
Yeah, I think I think there are different cultures, right? So in a place that's more strict, this would be fine. But in a place like there's signs right outside my polling place, like across the street. Whatever the foot distance is, they could be right across the street. Every car that drives by, we walk by groups of people on our sidewalk that are campaigning. My simple answer is, if the concern is undue influence close to the vote, then I do think that probably being similar to whatever current existing practices. It'd be odd that you campaign closer, but you can't have water. That'd be my guess. But again, I go back to what Ray said earlier. Different places have different cultures and different things, and the heat. I'm trying to imagine if I was in a place with a long line, would I appreciate a hot beverage or a cold cup of water? And I think that's why Ray's right. Why are there long lines in the first place? But I've never had to deal with that where I live right now in Massachusetts. And like the longest line ever was when I went to my city hall for the first time. They had early voting thing. I looked at that thing. I said, "Oh my, this is a massively long line." And I just waited for the actual election day and in and out in a couple minutes. So I think that's the issue. To me, that would deter. Like, it's not like, can you give out food and water in a line, but where is the polling place, and how long is the wait, and all those other things. But you're right, that's gonna change from locality. Again, I'm thinking of these Georgians listening to go, what are these New Englanders talking about? They don't know anything.
Well, not only, and I would add, I think it's a misconception on many people's part that this is about the last election. It's not. This has been going. This discussion has been going on since 2013, when the Supreme Court lifted the restriction on states which had been clearly involved. Poll taxes, all the things that you mentioned in voter suppression, no longer had to clear voting regulations with federal officials. And this tug of war has been on since then, since 2013. This is not, none of, I mean, even really before that, but it really picked up in earnest. So this isn't about the last election. And I think, again, this is part of the concern about even, oh, if it's a long line, well, you got to correct it the next time. It just doesn't get corrected. And that's why I get back to the issue of the implementation and intent.
So let me say something provocative then, right? Because this is what I think I hear in this is wherever we get the complaints about the lines are so long, it seems to be urban areas.
Right.
And urban areas tend to vote Democrat. And so Democrats run those elections. And then Democrats complain about the lines in those elections. And so somebody sitting in the suburbs could easily say, well, then fix it, right? It's your elected officials. What would you say to that person?
Well, again, to be honest, what I'm saying is I don't know how the systems work in various states. I don't know whether they have to work with resources that are given by the state legislatures, which are Republican. I don't know. I mean, it may be that Democrats are being negligent, or it could be that Republicans are being obstructionists. I don't know, to be perfectly honest.
What's the source of that funding that controls?
That's exactly right. So I'm saying I don't know whether it's the city failing to appropriate enough, or the state not, appropriating in accordance with its own regulations. And so I can't weigh in on that. I do know there is deeply the perception that electoral resources, rightly or wrongly, and I haven't seen a study on it, are disproportionately allocated, and that's controlled more often at the state than at the city level.
Interesting. So now, again, all my background on this is Connecticut, and it was all funded locally. But I'm with you. I don't know for sure what Georgia does. And so, yeah, state gave us nothing. My recollection of the time, the state gave us nothing for that kind of stuff. And so then it's a question, well, what do you want your taxes to be? And is that where you want to spend the money, right? All those kinds of things. And that becomes, if I can tell you where I've lived, if the lines turned into 2-hour lines, we'd have a new registrar of voters by the next election. And so it's a little bit easier in smaller towns because there is greater accountability, because there's just not this massive government, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, Enoch, anything on that?
I think the theme has been, we don't really know. In Georgia, we don't know the situation of the data. But yeah, you're right. I think when it comes back to intent, I mean, Ray said this goes before that significant case before the Supreme Court. I mean, people have been enacting plans and legislation since the very beginning, hundreds of years ago in this country to direct the outcomes of the vote by determining who can vote. Not to get super controversial, but country has a long reckoning in history with that. Blacks, but also other people of color.
Men, right? Yeah.
It goes way back. So I think the challenge is, if you write such an exacting law, it goes back and undercuts the localities to be able to do what's best for their groups. And that's always the tension with this massive system, right? We could write this, someone could put this really specific legislation, but in my experience, the more specific you get, the more likely you're going to get objected to, number one, and harder to get through. And then number two, specificity should go up and down with the level of perceived, honesty and genuineness of the people implementing those things. Competency as well as their character, right? So if we're thinking that this area historically has, egregious voter suppression sort of things, which is what the earlier Supreme Court cases were trying to deal with, then you have to be more specific to them. And so you write it that way. But I think it's tricky. It comes back down to why then hopefully people in those areas, and the church especially, can help change the heart and change the intent of those things. So this is a hugely big, intractable challenge. It feels that way, but I think there is hope. So I think Georgia is taking a step. It's really interesting. You didn't talk about the boycott stuff, though.
Well, I'll come to that next. We're probably gonna have to go a little bit fast because I'm not sure how much time we left. I think it's maybe 5-10 minutes tops. And so I don't hear any of us saying that we'd be on board with calling this Jim Crow on steroids and that kind of language, which I think was inflammatory and probably not helpful. You guys okay with me saying that, or would you disagree?
I can understand why you put it in the category of political language. Absolutely. I certainly, what I would say is that for people of my age, still old enough to remember past practices, it really brings back very bad memories.
Yeah. But Ray, now I'm going to push back, but you can tell me if it's okay to push back and say, but that's okay. The facts, though, to your point of, is it bringing back memories, or are there facts that are causing greater voter suppression? Is that still fair in that scenario too?
No, it's absolutely a fair question, and I mean, I think pointing out the fact that people, you pointed to the study that in fact people had raised a concern that it would decrease the participation of voting, and in fact it was the same, which is great. Now, the problem, of course, with these is always, did those end up being barriers that other organizing overcame, or what's in play here? And I don't know the answer to that. So again, a lot of some of what's happening here that I think there's evidence for. A lot of what's happening is really based on that history that you talked about, and statements that people make that seem to undergird the notion that it's not still quite an equal playing field.
It would, and I think if I had lived through that, if I was in Georgia back in the 50s and the 60s and lived through that, no matter what this did, you'd have a tough time convincing me it's helping. And it's certainly not going to be easier when you have a lot of politicians playing it as the worst thing. I think no matter what you think of it, it ain't Jim Crow on steroids, right? I think that's demeans what people went through to get the vote by calling something. You can argue, hey, this isn't fair, this isn't right, right? I think that's, but to call it that, I think is divisive and not helpful. And so, but push back with me on me if you guys disagree.
I guess for me, I would always want to read their reasoning for that. It's again, I think that quote comes from our president.
He did, and then he quoted things that weren't in the law when he said it. So I don't know if you want
so again, that's
go to his rationale.
I think just because something is incendiary or provocative does not. Right. I know you're not saying this also, Charles. It doesn't mean it's automatically just a political, trick or something. I guess to me, I would want to read it. Emotions can flare up, but then after the emotions wane or at least kind of temper down, we need the substantive best arguments for a particular position. So I would love to read someone's take on why that feels that way. And if it comes down to it was not revealed well, or we've got so much reason to be so concerned or even distrustful, I think that's a fair thing to read about. But I think those statements, and again, I'm not trying to blame the president or the media. That's just the nature of our reporting. I would love to read a comparison of this, which is why I think the New York Times piece that actually said it may not be as negative as people think, to me was appreciate that kind of reporting. Just the fact that the New York Times op-ed actually had someone sort of not, be so critical about that. Of course, the New York Times has different perspectives too. But so I think for me, I'd welcome that thought if that's how they feel. And actually, I would like as a pastor to know that brings up memories of things. I think that goes back to so much of going on with race and issues in our country. Someone looks at that and go, I don't see what the big deal of that one event is. And someone says, that was not one event. That's just the latest thing in this event. And that's what I think what people need to get. And as Christians, to try to empathize beyond the political party or beyond the event. It's just because someone has an overtly strong reaction doesn't mean they're overreacting. Chances are they have experiences or memories that we don't know about. And if more than one person is reacting that way, let's try to understand that. But at the same time, like I appreciate what Ray said, those strong reactions, we do need to temper that with the fair questions of, okay, is it accurate? Is it fair to accuse or say of these things? Because that may not help. Because again, all laws are attempt to manage competing factors and tensions, right? So you got to just get the best law we can, the best plan. So whether it's affirmative action, whether it's voter turnout, whatever, it's immigration, basically you're just doing the best you can today, both practically and politically. And so, the idea of bipartisanship, the idea of actually needing to compromise in the healthiest way is sometimes stifled when we use such strong language. Again, but I don't think that language is meant to build bridges in those instances. I think that language is meant to rally people to your base. And that's, again, we need to recognize there's two types of public discourse. There's one that fosters understanding and builds bridges. And there's times that galvanizes your base, clarifies your position, and serves as a rallying cry for organizing and activism. But we can't get those two mixed up. They're very different. And
well,
I think
it's easy not to mix them up because we never hear the former anymore.
Oh, maybe that's fair. Well, I think no. Actually, I would say it is there. It's just, and it's loud and clear. It's just not as reported on. I think there's
no, it's not. I think I completely agree with that. It's just not as mediagenic to report on the reasoned response.
Yeah,
so it's not mediagenic.
I'm reading a book right now, and the author keeps saying evangelicals this and evangelicals think that, evangelicals did this, and she's treating us as a monolith. And I'm like, well, that's not me. I don't agree with that. Right. But the voices you hear, right, are the voices who get reported on. And the more outrageous, and this is true, I think, on anything, the more outrageous you are, the more likely you are to get reported on. And so there's an advantage to doing it.
Yep. They say about the local news, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yep. Yeah. And so let's close out with just the boycotts so we don't run too much over. And so there's been other boycotts, but Major League Baseball pulled out the All-Star game out of Georgia over this. And so I'm going to tee it up both sides of this opposed to two questions. So they pull it out because of this, punishing, moving it to a state who has some of the same issues, because almost with the exception of the food provision, where they are the strictest in Georgia on that. Other ones do, a couple of others restrict food, but a little bit more liberally. But they moved it to a state that has some of these same issues and are happy to be working with the government in Cuba and the government in China. And so speak to that, if you will, about how you react to it. I think you can get a sense of how I react to it.
Yeah, I would say that two things, one of which with regard to other countries are in our country and other countries don't purport to be democracies, right? And we can have a debate about whether countries in democratic countries, companies in democratic countries should do business or sell their products to authoritarian or rights abusing. I mean, this is a huge debate that goes on, and they get boycotted for that too. So, but I do think it's not unreasonable to say, if in fact I believe this is a democracy suppressing effort, that I would not want to support it. And again, this has been part of the American terrain, I think, for some time, going back to the battle against apartheid, American government companies supporting and not supporting it. This is, I think, emerged in some of the other civil rights issues, particularly around sexual identity, etc. So it's a feature that we're going to continue to see, and it really does, I think, get back to the bottom line question of whether you think there is an intent here to violate the rights of others. And I think if they don't think there's any intent they can't see the logic of it. And I get that why would a company be involved in this? This is just about voting regulations. If you see it strongly as the intent being to actually suppress the rights, the democratic rights of others, you would say without question, how could you overlook this?
Yeah.
And if you go to the comment lines on a number of these companies, I just followed the one on Delta the other day, you got people on both sides. I will never fly this airline again. You need to stay out of politics. On the other hand, I will never fly you again until you stand up and oppose this democratic rights stealing, democratic small d rights stealing legislation.
Yeah,
So
I just sit there and say, so I see this on the whole being fairly balanced. Communist China has people in concentration camps, right? And they're suppressing people's rights. So I look at those, and Cuba does the same thing. I look at those and go, it's night and day difference, right? And so if Georgia isn't a place where you can do business, then I don't know how you can do business in those countries.
Well, because I think you can hold your own states to different standards than you do other countries. I don't think that's unreasonable at all.
Okay.
And again, I'm not arguing one way or the other. The argument has always been we should allow commerce, exchanges within limits, and at times with sanctions, depending on the situation, because in fact, that could be a means to support democratic thinking, people seeing alternatives, etc. I'm not arguing that right or wrong. That's tended to be the posture that we've taken as a nation.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even want to get into our weapons sales. I mean, let's not talk about Delta. So
whole different call.
Right. I mean, we sell to countries that kill people and saw them in pieces, right? I mean, so I get that. I don't always agree with it, but it's certainly consistent with what we've done. That we would hold ourselves to a higher standard than we would our trading partners doesn't seem at all inconsistent.
Gotcha. Enoch, last word.
Well, on that, my general view is, I appreciate everything that's being said and I agree. I think it's virtually impossible to be consistent. So, especially in our intertwined economy and political system. Biblically, I go back to characters like Esther and Daniel, who by their excellent work or service perpetuated what would be considered fairly non-Christian entities and cultures and systems and stuff like that. And yet they are still uniformly, Joseph in Pharaoh's court as well. And so I think that goes into the larger issue of does a boycott do anything? My guess, again, not knowing the intentions of Major League Baseball or Home Depot or Delta or these things, and again, never probably having access to them, I do think there's something to be said on a pragmatic level. A boycott is not necessarily for economic force, at least on these things, because they're all going to usually be short-termed. Someone may say, I will never fly you again. But then they're like, oh, hey, look, there's a sale. So I think people are just gonna. I think it's hard, and I think again, these corporations are beholden to their stockholders if they're publicly traded in the bottom line. So it doesn't mean that everything they're done is immoral, but it does mean that they have a fiduciary responsibility to act in certain things. And so it's different than like an individual or a family. But again, people can boycott anything, but once you boycott that over an issue of anything, you realize the nature of our economics. So I don't think boycotts are about 100% consistency. I'd like to think so, but I think it's about a tactical moment to take advantage of a certain cultural thing. If the people doing boycotts of large organizations, corporations with that political clout and financial clout can lend their influence in a moment, I think there's something to be stewarded. Whether this is that moment or not, I don't know. But I do think that the idea of something being consistent, it's really hard. Well, in the United States of America, to be, one of the arguments you'll hear is any economic blessing you have today, even if you just moved here, is largely built on in enslaved people's labor, right? That there's an argument there. So there's no getting around that. That's a very common thing written about and said about I can tell African American studies, right? Even if you just moved here, if you're experiencing the prosperity of this nation, you are doing that on the back of enslaved men and women throughout the centuries. And so, again, that other people find that abhorrent because they'll say, I never enslaved anyone and stuff, but that becomes this really difficult. Yeah. So there's no system in the world that is not tainted by those things. So I don't really see boycotts as about issues of consistency or even principle, like super consistent. It's more about being a steward in the moment right now to lend it to a small victory that may be short term, but to do that. So again, the best intent would be they did this to help lend their voice to an important issue right now. Most cynical, they did it to help the bottom line, and they said something to appease certain people, but didn't say enough to actually offend everyone. But that gets too much into the intent. So I look at boycotts. That's my general view. They're going to have to make a statement. They can't not make a statement at this point, like especially if you're based in Georgia. And Delta is one of the biggest, if not the biggest employer, I think, in Georgia. So I sympathize with the business leaders. People are going to listen and go, man, this guy's just too nice to politicians and business leaders. But I guess I feel like I do talk to some of these folks in a small scale behind closed doors. And I think we're called as pastors to serve and shepherd them and disciple them as well too. And I'm going to guess that, yes, the abuses and potential abuses are great, but the pressures are also great. And so that's my general grace tone thing. When it comes to overall, I want to try to understand where they're coming from to build bridges. At least that's my personal calling.
Well, we look forward to the government we will have one day where there won't be boycotts, because there won't be injustice, because that is the second coming. And it will be a beautiful time. We don't enjoy it today, but we're still called to do justice today. And we're still called to work for the shalom of our city. Going back to your point about, it's an unjust world. It's unfair, unkind. It's not worse than Babylon, I would argue. You might want to say it's equivalent to, I won't, but it's not worse than Babylon. And still the people of Israel were told, work for the shalom of your city, right? In a very pagan, hedonistic culture. And so I think that's our call too. So I'll get the last word, I guess, on that one. But guys, thanks so much for being with us again to talk about this. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I find it fascinating to hear how you guys come at some of this stuff and help. And I think it's really helpful to come at it from what guiding principles should we have based on our faith as Christians. And so I always like starting there, and I appreciate you guys putting it there and then just reacting honestly and candidly. And I hope you had fun and enjoyed it. But thanks.
And could I have one other principle that I hope this podcast maybe models, however imperfectly for others, that across so many of the walls that are present in our world today, in our society, in our commonwealth, as Christians, we would really start to listen to each other, hear each other's stories. We don't have to agree on everything, but let's really get to know each other far better than we do. Stop treating each other as stereotypes.
Yeah, that's a great last word, right? So you get the last word. So thanks again, guys. And not just thanks for being with us on the podcast. Thank you for your ministry in the greater Boston area, but in New England. And I know you both do things globally. So thank you so much for all you're doing to advance the kingdom, not just here. And I'd like to thank our audience for being with us again. Hope this was useful in understanding different perspectives to Ray's point. It's not all these political issues, I think, are not you're crazy and I'm evil. I think there's an understanding here that is, hey, we both come at it from a Christian perspective and land in different places. And that's okay. And so hope it's helpful to understand that and maybe calls you to action about who else you should listen to and who else we should listen to that we might not be hearing to understand those perspectives. And that's where I think you said it last time that one of the greatest greatest ways to love someone is to listen to them. And so let's listen to folks and hear where they are. And that opens doors. When we listen to people, it opens doors to sharing Jesus. And so I'd also like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton. Our next podcast is April 29th. We'll have a guest host, Heidi Joy, who was with us before. She has a ministry called Breathe with her husband, Rich, where they do pastoral counseling and pastoral soul care for pastors and their spouses. And she also has a ministry to pastors' wives. And she'll have the Reverend Dr. Virginia Ward from Abundant Life Church and from Gordon Conwell on that. And they'll just be talking about life as a pastor's spouse. And so, guys, thanks again. God bless you. Have a great week.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.